Hey guys, before we get started with today's show, I have some exciting news to share. Your financial pharmacist is now offering fee-only comprehensive financial planning services led by certified financial planner Tim Baker. We're dedicated to serving pharmacists like you who want something better than the status quo. We offer our clients an honest, education-focused approach that is specifically catered toward handling the high-income, student loan-laden, demanding career track of you, the pharmacists we serve. Our goal is simple: to get you from thinking, I don't know exactly what to do with my money, but I know I need to do something, to confidently saying, I know exactly what I need to do month in and month out to get out of debt, save for retirement, and achieve my financial goals. You can learn more by visiting yfpplanning.com. Again, that's yfpplanning.com.
I just try and reassure them first and foremost that, hey, you don't have to make a decision ASAP, but we have to get that conversation going.
You're listening to the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, a show all about inspiring you, the pharmacy professional, on your path towards achieving financial freedom. Hi, I'm Tim Baker, and on this week's episode, we bring back Christina Slavonik, who is a member of the YFP team and a CFP just like me, and we're going to discuss the student loan grace period and why the student loan grace period is not that gracious. We'll break down the difference between grace period, forbearance, and deferment, and then we'll also talk through some scenarios that you can consider with regard to your student loan strategy and the grace period. Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 107 of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Christina, welcome back to the podcast. It's been a while since you've been on. How have you been?
Been doing great. Yeah, thanks so much.
So, a little update for the listeners out there. Christina, who I think came on to the team in March, she was actually out in Baltimore in YFP planning headquarters, and we spent a week last week, kind of just doing some training and just working together side by side, which I think was fantastic. I feel like anytime we can get in person, not just on the YFP planning side, but just with the Tims and everything, it's always a good, productive use of time. So. How was your visit to Baltimore?
It was wonderful. Yeah, Baltimore. I just love the history, and of course, and you and Shay were very, very hospitable, and got to have some crabs. I've never had to open crabs before, so thank you to Paul Eichenberg and his wife Anne for being so patient. I think I was a fast learner, but yeah, it always helps to have a good tutor to help you with that.
Yeah, so we picked crabs with Paul on one of the evenings. Christina was here, and it was out on the water. It was beautiful. So yeah, big props to Paul and his wife Anne for hosting. That was fantastic. So Christina, we're going to talk about the grace period, and for a lot of those out there, we talk about the grace period as something that maybe isn't as gracious as one would think, and really what we're talking about is really that waiting period between graduation and when you actually start your loan payment. So for a lot of people, this is going to be, for their federal loans, it's going to be 6 months. If you have Perkins loans out there, it could be up to 9 months where you're actually, not on the hook for any of the payments that are out there. There are some exceptions out there that if you, are in the military or something of that sort, you can actually get a longer grace period. The problem is, during this period of time, the interest that is basically built in, month after month, year over year, really, if you go out that far, is unforgiving, and it's not so gracious. So I think for us today, what we want to talk about is, along with some of the nuances of what grace is and kind of what are the differences between, grace, deferment, and forbearance, as actually what you can do, to, mitigate some of that, during that 9 month time. So Christina, for you, when you think about grace versus deferment versus forbearance, can you tell the audience, basically break it down, like what the difference is between those things and how we should kind of go about the grace period in general?
Sure. So yeah, just reiterating what you had just said, the grace period is the waiting period between your graduation, the actual start of loan repayment. So there's also some other caveats. So if you're going from full-time schooling to part-time schooling, and then if you withdraw from school, your grace period may also end. But the whole point of the grace period is just to give you some time to hopefully find that job, and so that you have an income within that 6 to 9 months to start repaying back those loans. So looking at the difference, deferment allows you to completely stop making payments. So if you decide to return back to school, you can take advantage of that. Whereas forbearance, you stop the payment requirement altogether due to a financial hardship, and there are different definitions of that and how that works.
Yeah, and sometimes if you're going into a residency program, you can actually qualify for a deferment, and sometimes they categorize that as more schooling or forbearance, just because maybe the residency doesn't pay you kind of anywhere close to what you would actually be able to pay off your loans with. So it is important to understand the difference, but by and large, what we often say is that the grace period should be looked at with absolute caution. I feel like when we first started talking on this subject, Christina, and we would go and we would talk to residents or people that had just got done residency or a fellowship or just even current residents, we would say, hey, how many of you deferred or put your loans into forbearance after the grace period? And a lot of them opted into that just because just making ends meet with that residency salary was tough.
Yeah.
The problem is that we'll talk about this a little bit more is the fact of the matter is that you have this period of time to account for the period of time where life is adjusting. What we often see is that the lifestyle creep can kick in. We sometimes see that it's just one of those things that are in the back of our mind that we know that this maybe 6-figure monster is looming overhead, but we just don't want to confront that quite yet. And typically, the longer that we kick the can down the road, the more painful it's going to be. And it's typically when we go from the grace period into repayment. So if you don't do anything, that standard repayment plan is going to be your default plan. So again, the numbers per the averages is that if you have an average pharmacy loan debt of 160, the standard plan, which is over 10 years, it's about an $1,800 per month payment. So if you don't do anything, once you go from that grace period into the payment, whether it's standard or one of the income driven, all of the dollars that are in the interest column, so you have your principal and your interest is just being accumulated throughout school for those unsubsidized loans, and for the subsidized loans, they're not. But once you basically have the act of going into repayment, all of those interest dollars migrate over to principal. So it basically clears the ledger of interest, but then those dollars are now making interest and interest on top of interest, and that's where it can get very predatory. So one of the things that we'll kind of talk about is what to do during the grace period. And how to tackle that. But it's super, we talk about this time and time again, and it's kind of we beat the drum on this is, it's all about intentionality. Mm-hmm. So for some people, as they're looking at, and Christina, you and I can attest to this, just working with so many residents,
definitely,
and new grads, is the job market is real, and sometimes it's not, it doesn't line up as quickly as you would want. So that's where the grace period really can come into play. However, I think there are some ways that we can get into repayment easier and at maybe a more preferential monthly payment that is actually doable even on a resident's salary. So in terms of some loopholes that we can talk about with regard to the grace period, what have you seen as kind of been the big loophole to kind of shift the default in terms of that 6 month or that 9 month waiting period to get into repayment?
The shift to think about, I know some people they're wanting, the moment they get out, they're like, oh, I want to pay down this debt. They want to, consolidate, but just be careful to make sure you're weighing all your options, because even though you're in grace period, if you do, once you do decide to consolidate, or even refinance, that grace period, will actually, you'll lose it. So students who consolidate during the grace period will lose the remainder of that grace period. So that's why we recommend that, say for instance you're about to enter a repayment, within 60 days or so. If you do decide to consolidate, just wait if you can to the end of that grace period. So you're kind of, backing it up to that point. So, you don't have to immediately, be out of grace period and start having to pay back that urgently.
Yeah. So for some people, depending on what the strategy is, and we'll kind of talk through some examples here, but for some people that they don't want to lose the grace period because the income isn't there to support that payment, something like a consolidation is ill-advisable because you typically will lose that grace period. However, if you're a pharmacist that you want to get into repayment as quickly as possible because you want to start the clock maybe on PSLF, or you just want to get in the process of paying those loans down, consolidation is a great way to kind of cut through the grace period, because for some people they don't need it. They have a job before they even graduate, or and they basically can start the repayment process. So it just depends on where that's at. Now, again, from a refinance perspective, anytime, so to just kind of recap of where we're at with refinance. So consolidation is basically where we take one or more of our federal loans and we basically consolidate them down into 1 to 2 consolidation loans. And typically the way this works is when you graduate, oftentimes, we'll see pharmacists that have FEL loans, which are kind of like the old federal loans. They'll have Stafford subsidized, Stafford unsubsidized. They might have a Perkins loan. They might have a private loan. So all of the ones except for the private loan are eligible for the federal loan repayment. So that's going to be your standard default. And then one of the 4 income-driven ones, which is going to be IBR, ICR, revised pay-as-you-earn, and pay-as-you-earn. However, especially for like the Perkins and the FEL loans, we often have to basically solve the square peg round hole. So the FEL and the Perkins loans don't fit into the income-driven ones. So we basically have to consolidate those down to typically a consolidation subsidized and a consolidation unsubsidized to get into those income-driven plans. And what a lot of people do is they fail to do that. So in certain situations, we'll have clients that are halfway through, PSLF, it'll be 5 years in, but they might have $30,000, $40,000 of FEL loans that don't qualify for forgiveness because they never consolidate those down. So my thought is, you want to do this on the basically from Jump Street. So if you just graduated and you're unsure, timing your consolidation is important, because if you do it like right now and you don't have a job lined up, in 60 days the payments are going to start, which might not necessarily be a bad thing, or you wait till the end of the consolidation period. The one thing to really focus on, Christina, is like once you consolidate, any payments that you might have previously made, so that's, in the example of the 5-year, making payments for 5 years, that clock starts over. So that's really important to really understand. So that's a big roadblock, is if you ask yourself, how many years have I been paying towards a forgiveness strategy before you consolidate? Because if you consolidate, then the time in that situation goes from 5 years to 0 years, and that's no bueno. So refinance, on the other example, is when you say, hey, thanks for federal system, it's been great, but I'm going to take my income and my payment history and my credit, and I'm going to go out to, say, one of the YFP partners at CommonBond or SoFi or LendKey or Earnest, and try to get a better rate. So this is where, I'm paying 6.5% with the federal government. I'm going to try to refi down and get a 5.5% rate, at a term that fits me and my budget. The big reminder there is once you go from private to federal, once we go from private to federal, we can't go back. So that's really important to remember as well. So that's kind of a brief overview. So again, when we talk about the grace period loophole, what we're really talking about is consolidation. And if we consolidate, then if you don't want that 6-month period, we can actually cut that by 1/3 and get you into repayment, in basically in 2 months. So that's kind of what we're looking at. So Christina, when we talk about the grace period, what are the things that we do with clients, maybe from a basic level when we talk about, maybe goals or budget? how would you start the conversation with regard to what do we do? What do we do during a grace period and really beyond that?
Yeah, so basically, Tim, you just want to establish, some ground rules. Obviously,
Yeah.
What their job situation looks like, and if they're ready to just, start looking at this. Because if they don't do anything, at least they have, the standard plan that they'll just default into. So we do get, quite a few people that they're finishing residency and about to start their job, and then they start kind of panicking. They're like, well, what do we do, with our student loans during this time? So I just try and reassure them first and foremost that, hey, you don't have to make a decision ASAP, but we have to get that conversation going. So firstly, looking at their budget, seeing exactly where they're at with their cash flow is the number one thing, and then formalizing a repayment plan from there. So you had already mentioned, the repay and then the pay, as well as the other RBR plans. Those are, the typical ones that we see people falling into. And then, if you can do it with PSLF, what that looks like. And then if you or can't qualify for PSLF or the public student loan forgiveness, what that also looks like. So, of course, PSLF, you will pay the least amount as humanly possible. Especially important to at least begin thinking about, that from your P4 year to PGY1. And if you are going to be pursuing PSLF or have a job lined up with a nonprofit, consolidating to get into that repayment is so important because, you want that clock to start ticking the moment you are starting to repay those loans.
Yeah. So if we break that down, and we can kind of use a real world example here. We had a client that actually is going from their PGY 2 year into a nonprofit hospital position. So she was weighing a few different options, and she was looking at an option that paid her, I think, about $98,000 for the nonprofit hospital, and she had about $270,000 in debt, so to speak. And then she was also weighing a for-profit offer, which was about 125 in that area, and she actually decided to go with the nonprofit that paid her substantially less because, as you said, you're going to pay the least amount as humanly possible over the course of those 10 years. It's not even a comparison. So for her, it's really getting into the repayment as quickly as possible. Now, again, if you're looking at like you mentioned a P4 year going into a PGY1 or something like that, you want to start the clock on PSLF as soon as possible. So that's typically where you want to get through the grace period. Maybe you start the payments in 60 days, and then really start the clock on that 120 payments, hopefully over those 10 years. So those are all great points. So what if PSLF is not on the table? What if you say, hey Tim, that's great, I'm going to go work for a for-profit hospital, or I'm going to go work in industry or something like that? What's a strategy that we would look at, and how would the grace period affect us in that mode in your estimation?
There's just, really what you're comfortable with. Non-PSLF, obviously you're looking at, you can't have repay, but the thing is, if there is any forgiveness, it's going to be non-PSLF forgiveness. So at the end of your payments, you will have to pay taxes back on whatever is forgiven. So having knowing that in advance and being able to sock some extra money away at the end of that term is important, because you don't want to have a huge, what we call a tax bomb on your tax return that final year when you do get everything paid off.
Yeah. So if you're transitioning from like a P4, like you said, Christina, into something that's for profit, typically something outside of PSLF forgiveness makes sense if you have a debt to income ratio higher than 2-to-1. So this is example is, hey Tim, I have $300,000 in debt. I'm offered $100,000 in my for profit job. What do I do? And this is typically where we want to get you into one of the income driven plans and get that started as quickly as possible. So again, in the grace period, it probably makes sense for you to do that. And then the idea is to, one, lower your AGI just like you would in PSLF. get those payments down as low as possible. But in the non-PSLF strategy, what you really want to do is save for that tax bomb, as you mentioned, and make sure that there are dollars, set aside for that. So you're not surprised by that.
Yeah.
So, and really both of those cases in the PSLF and the non-PSLF, if you can, again, given the budget and things that you mentioned, maybe having a little bit of cushion with an emergency fund, it's really imperative in my estimation is to get into repayment as quickly so you can start the clock, for forgiveness. The last one we should probably talk about is an aggressive option. So if you are of the mind of, say, like our Tim Church, where he is, in repayment very aggressively, in this scenario, the grace period might not even matter. Now, it could for some, because if you're a recent graduate and you're waiting to get into repayment, sometimes when you refi, the refi companies want to see proof of income. They want to see proof of payment that you actually have a track record of doing so. So sometimes doing nothing and just going through the grace period, or at least consolidate them and maybe, get into repayment more quickly might make sense. But from there, you probably want to shop refi when you feel eligible, when you feel like you have a long enough track record, and get that process going. You could also do nothing and stay in the standard plan after the grace period, and just know that interest will capitalize from the interest column into the principal column, which is not necessarily a fun thing. Any thoughts on that, Christina, in terms of what you see?
Well, just be black or white. Don't be anywhere in the middle. If you're
Yeah,
gonna
exactly.
make a decision to do aggressive the whole way. Just like Tim Church is a very good example, as well as many other clients and people we've had on the podcast. I know those that listen on a regular basis have heard their stories. But yeah, just put all you have into it, and head to the ground and get it done.
But it's one of those things, though, that it's kind of our human nature where if I'm putting the least amount towards my loans, sometimes I might feel guilty. So maybe I get a tax refund, or maybe I get a graduation gift, and I want to put that towards my loans and get the process started. But if you're seeking a forgiveness play, it's like you want to fly that flag until you are forgiven. But human nature, we kind of revert to the mean. So that's not necessarily the right thing to do. So important to, again, understand your strategy and stick to the strategy.
Exactly.
At the end of the day, what we often like to say is this is more about intentionality. And I think what sometimes happens with the grace period is that we lose some of the intentionality because we get comfortable, in kind of that transitionary space, or we just kind of forget. We have clients that will say, "Oh yeah, the loans. Now I have a bill for $1,800. What do I do?" We're seeing more and more people become proactive and I think intentional, which is I think it's a great sign that, maybe, we're moving the needle, in a bit, and that, people can speak through the different strategies and that type of thing. But the grace period, I think, like you said, it's not necessarily gracious from a math perspective, but then also from a behavioral perspective, just because of that, that half a year, so to speak, where you get comfortable without having to really worry about the loans. And
Yeah.
me, that can be almost as problematic as the math. So, I think, to kind of reiterate, the grace period, not necessarily gracious is going to be different than, the forbearance and the deferment options that are going to be out there for many, especially if, you're having problems finding a job in those maybe pharmacy saturated markets, or if you're going to residency, you can easily opt into those types of things. But our suggestion over this grace period is, one, does it make sense to cut through that? And if it doesn't, I think just having a plan going forward with the loans, because it's not hyperbole to say that the decision of what you do with the loans, especially out of the gate, can be hundreds of thousands of dollars one way or the other, especially with the average loan forgiveness programs that we're seeing.
Yeah. Make a huge difference.
Yeah, and you've seen it, Christina, when we're working with clients, is when we put that all on the decision table, for a lot of people, it's the first it's a really first time that they've actually looked at the numbers and actually have seen okay, if I go down this path, this is what I'm, this is what I'm going to pay in total, and this is kind of my monthly payment that I can expect. And that can be shocking for a lot of people, especially if they've been in this mindset, going through pharmacy school of just kind of sticking your head down and worrying about getting through pharmacy school because that's really hard in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Financial side has kind of been buried. And it's funny when we go to, the APHA conference and I talk to students there and I say, hey, what do you, what's your thoughts about your student loans? It's like, I don't even think about my student loans. Like I just, it's almost like they stick their head in the sand and they don't worry about them, which I think can be problematic in and of itself. But the grace period can be almost an extension of that because we're kicking the can another half year down the road for us to actually, come to grips with what we have to pay back and how do we use the tools out there. So
exactly.
So once again, Christina, thank you for coming on the YFP podcast to lend your voice to this discussion about the grace period and student loans. Always great to have you represented here. And I think we covered a lot of ground. I think we talked about the difference between the grace period, forbearance, and deferment. We talked about different strategies and the grace period loophole with regard to consolidation. And what we really want as a community is for you, the recent pharmacy graduate, to really be intentional with your student loans. Now, if you're looking for additional resources, additional podcasts to listen to with regard to the student loans, and as you're transitioning, I want you to point you to 3 different episodes. Episode 51, which is 8 things to do or avoid to evade financial purgatory after graduation. And then 52, the one following, is 5 steps to crush your student loans. Great resources. And then finally, episode 99 is key financial moves for pharmacy graduates. I think this podcast, along with those other 3, will really equip you on your journey to pay back your student debt. So thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, and looking forward to next time.